I remember the early days when life seemed cloudless, as if we lived in a world without betrayals or shocking moments that could tear a heart apart. My name is Michael, and I grew up in an ordinary American suburb where neighbors' lawns stretched one after another, forming an almost endless green corridor leading to the heart of our small town. My parents taught me from childhood that true love exists, and I believed it, up until the very moment reality decided to prove the opposite in the most painful, bitter way. I met Jennifer at a party hosted by our mutual friend David. He was quite the party guy, loved gathering people at his place, throwing loud get-togethers with dancing, cocktails, and fun games. I almost didn't want to leave the house that night. I'd had a rough week at college and was preoccupied with a big group project in my management course, but David insisted I come, promising it would be one of the best events of our summer. After some hesitation, I agreed. When I walked into the living room, it was crowded. Strings of lights bounced off the walls, reflecting in framed pictures and windows. The music was loud but not deafening. Nobody was shouting. People were laughing, chatting, and dancing near a table overflowing with cups, punch, and snacks. I didn't notice Jennifer right away, but when our eyes met, I felt a jolt in my chest. She was stunning in her simple, slightly loose sweater and high-waisted jeans. Long earrings shimmered faintly in her hair, and it seemed for a moment that she froze too when she looked in my direction. We ended up talking almost until morning. A blend of whispers, laughter, and loud music, which occasionally faded whenever someone awkwardly switched tracks. We were drawn to each other, and I couldn't pass up the chance to get to know her better. She told me about her interest in photography, that she often took a film camera and headed into the mountains to capture special moments on film. While I talked about how I dreamed of starting my own business and working on projects that could make people's lives more convenient. It felt like we were looking in the same direction, the road ahead filled with romance and freedom. By dawn, we had exchanged phone numbers. I carefully entered her number, making sure not to make a single-digit mistake, then anxiously waited for the call to go through. She smiled when she saw my name appear on her screen. We both laughed, a bit embarrassed. From that day on, everything in my life started to shift. I remember our first movie date. The film was nothing special, just a forgettable romantic comedy, but it felt like the best possible outing. We sat in the back row. When the theater lights went down, she moved a bit closer to me. I could smell her perfume, a slightly sweet scent with a hint of bitterness that reminded me of wildflowers. From then on, that fragrance became associated in my mind with warmth and comfort. I remember how she watched the screen while I, trying not to be obvious, mostly watched her, my heart skipping every time she moved her arm, gently fixed her hair, or laughed quietly. On our way home, she suggested stopping by a 24-hour diner for burgers with crispy crusts, supposedly the best in the city. We walked through nightlit streets under flickering street lamps, talking about future plans and reminiscing about our high school days, not noticing how quickly time flew by. The more we talked, the stronger our feelings became, or so I thought. We started meeting regularly. I got to know her friends, initially feeling a bit awkward because they were a close-knit group who had known each other for a long time. But they welcomed me surprisingly warmly. One of her good friends, Steve, was an easygoing guy obsessed with music. He could talk for hours about rare vinyl records. Jennifer's girlfriends mostly shared that same fun, open attitude, speaking freely. With each new conversation, I could see how much she enjoyed our time together, sharing small joys or occasional troubles. For example, she would mention how tough it could be to find common ground with her mom, who still saw her as a little girl and worried she might get into trouble. She'd call every evening to remind Jennifer to stay safe. I'd listen and smile, understanding that I was raised in a very similar way. Little by little, it felt like our bond was deepening. I loved waking up to see her texts. "Good morning, Michael. What's your plan for the day?" Or, "I miss you. Can we meet tonight?" There was such ease in our conversations that I became convinced things were moving toward something serious. I even started thinking about moving into a larger apartment so that eventually I could ask her to move in with me. I imagined us picking out furniture together, debating about wallpaper or curtains, then arriving at a decision, and making the place truly ours. Of course, we had our small arguments, like any couple, sometimes over where we'd go for the evening. I'd want bowling, she'd prefer a quiet cafe. Sometimes she resented that I devoted too much time to my studies and projects. Meanwhile, I wasn't always fond of how she spent rowdy weekends with her friends, staying out at bars until morning, just having fun, as she put it. But it seemed trivial. We managed to talk it through, listen to each other, and compromise. I believed we were growing together, learning to be a team where two people support each other. I remember one almost childish spat. She wanted to leave for a week to a neighboring state to tour small wineries with her girlfriends, inviting me along. I refused because it coincided with a crucial phase of my internship, and I simply could not get time off. She was angry that I was prioritizing my career over a shared getaway. I tried explaining that it wasn't a matter of priorities. I just couldn't leave work for the next 6 months. Eventually, we patched things up, albeit somewhat tensely. She said she'd let me handle my business while she went away for a couple of days, and then came back. It felt like we'd resolved it, and the conflict fizzled out. Looking back at these details, I genuinely believed that arguments were a normal part of a relationship. I never thought these little tensions might foreshadow something bigger that could destroy everything I believed in. But as it turned out, perfect relationships can be just a facade, concealing cracks you fail to notice for too long. The first alarm sounded when she started acting strangely distracted. We'd agree on a time to meet, and she might forget or show up very late. She used to be punctual. If delayed, she'd let me know in advance. Now she'd sometimes be half an hour or even an hour late, only then texting something like, "Sorry, I'm running late. Be there in 15." Occasionally she just wouldn't pick up, and when I called back, she'd say she was busy with something very important, but wouldn't explain further. Her eyes drifted off when we talked, and if I brought up future plans, her replies felt shallow, and she'd quickly change the topic. I tried calming myself with the idea that maybe she was just going through a difficult period, or had new obligations. Perhaps work had become more stressful. She did mention wanting to advance her career in event planning, working with a small agency where she handled photo booth setups and decor for events. I believed it was interesting and that she was simply immersed in her work. I naively assumed that someone could get distant when they have major projects and tight deadlines. After all, I'd been there myself. But soon, mutual friends started asking if everything was okay with us. We appeared together less often. People trying to reach her would then call me, assuming she was with me, but I never knew where she was. I would shrug it off, insisting we were both just busy, that we didn't have time for parties. But inside, my anxiety was growing, a vague suspicion that my perspective on the world had shifted, and everything looked far less hopeful than before. Things got worse after a specific incident. My friends and I planned to attend a concert by a local indie band. Jennifer intended to come too, but never showed up. At first, I waited by the entrance, sending texts like, "Where are you?" She replied, "Still at work, I'll finish quickly and be there soon." But an hour and a half went by, and the concert started without her. Finally, I got another text. "I'm so sorry. My boss asked me to finish something urgent. I can't make it." So I watched the show in a weirdly disappointed state, wanting to enjoy the music I loved but also feeling my mood completely ruined. We didn't see each other for days. She barely texted. Then, out of nowhere, she showed up at my place with pizza and ice cream, smiling, telling me she missed me. In that moment, I couldn't be angry or start a fight. All my resentments melted away. I saw her sparkling eyes and heard her apologies. My heart softened. We had a great night together, ordered even more food, watched old recordings of famous stand-up comedians, and laughed. She shared some funny work stories about sudden changes in her assignments. Everything felt normal again, as if restored to how it had been. But life has a way of shattering such illusions in an instant. The real jolt came to me unexpectedly. My childhood friend Jason invited me out for coffee, saying he had something very important to tell me. Unaware of any trouble, I went to a small coffee shop near my house where we often hung out. I found him at a corner table, nervously gripping a cup of latte that had already gone cold. He looked tense, unsure how to begin. He asked how things were going with Jennifer. I shrugged, admitting we had some communication issues but that it was probably fixable. Then he handed me his phone, asking me to look at a photo a mutual acquaintance had sent him. It showed a group of people in a downtown bar. In the background, I recognized my Jennifer, sitting close to some guy, her hand resting on his knee as they both laughed like the world was theirs. My heart plummeted. Of course, one photo proves nothing. But inside, a storm of jealousy, confusion, and anger erupted. Who was this guy? Why was she so close to him, and why hadn't she told me she was meeting someone? Suddenly, all her recent excuses, "I'm busy, I can't make it, I'm tired, I want to be alone," looked like disgusting lies. Jason was visibly uncomfortable. He said he felt obliged to show me so I'd be aware. He stressed that maybe they were just friends or coworkers, but they seemed far too cozy. I left the coffee shop in a daze, lacking words to describe my feelings. I scrolled through our old messages, looking for a hint that she was cheating or at least growing distant. But no obvious clues came up, just scattered fragments. That evening, I mustered the courage to call her and ask where she was. My voice trembled, though I tried to sound normal. She answered cheerfully, saying she was heading home from a gathering with coworkers. They had a few drinks, but everything was fine. I stayed silent about the picture. Maybe I was scared she'd confirm my worst fears, or that I'd wrongly accuse her if I was mistaken. Over the next few days, my doubts grew worse. I couldn't look at her the same. Every laugh, every glance at her phone made me think, who are you texting? Who are you talking to? I hated these thoughts because I always believed relationships should be built on trust. I never wanted to be the jealous type who snoops through phones or uses sneaky tactics to uncover the truth. But once distrust sets in, it grows like a weed in an abandoned garden. Then came the decisive blow. One evening, I got a call from Emily, one of Jennifer's friends. She said she had something important to tell me and asked if we could meet in person. My heart pounded. I knew no good news was coming, or she wouldn't sound so tense. We met at a small pizzeria after work. Emily sat there looking guilty, an untouched soda in front of her. I sat down and asked what was going on. She looked upset and ashamed. Gathering her courage, she explained that she had recently seen Jennifer at an event where Emily was also working, and Jennifer wasn't alone. Emily initially assumed it was just a coworker, but their behavior made it clear they were more than friends. They held hands, laughed together, and Emily heard the guy calling Jennifer, "baby." Emily hadn't confronted her, she didn't have the guts. But she did snap a photo. From the back at first, then from another angle that clearly showed their faces. I felt as if someone had poured ice water over me. It's indescribably awful to have your suspicions confirmed. Emily went on to say she was torn about whether to tell me, but she felt I needed to know. She stressed she didn't like Jennifer's behavior. She didn't know how serious it was or how long it had been going on, but it certainly wasn't just a platonic friendship. She showed me the photos. Indeed, they were in that same coffee shop, but on a different day, a different moment, yet still with the same tender touches, the same gaze Jennifer had once reserved only for me. I wanted to scream from pain and disappointment, to walk away from everything, our home, our past, the music we danced to. But I knew I had to do something, needed answers, even if they'd hurt. I asked Emily if she knew who he was. She shrugged, saying she'd heard his name might be Brian. Apparently someone new in Jennifer's work circle, perhaps in a higher position. That was all Emily knew. She suggested I confront Jennifer directly rather than wait. That evening, I couldn't bring myself to call or text Jennifer, though my hands shook with the urge to demand an explanation. Instead, I sat in my car outside my apartment, staring blankly, imagining how she'd respond. Maybe she'd say it was a colleague and nothing happened. Or she'd deny everything, accuse me of snooping, insisting I had invented it all. 1,000 scenarios played out in my head, each one worse than the last. While I sat there, she called me. I froze but answered. She sounded excited, as if she sensed nothing amiss, asking where I was. She planned to stop by. Haltingly, I lied that I was at my parents' place, unable to see her that night. I don't know why, maybe I just wasn't ready to face her. She said, "All right, maybe tomorrow then? We have to talk about something important." I mumbled yes, and hung up. In the darkness of my car, I realized a harsh confrontation was looming. The longer I waited, the more it would hurt. That night, I barely slept, twisting and turning under a suffocating dread. I drifted off for a few hours before dawn and dreamt I was watching her walk away, hand in hand with someone else, as I screamed for her to stop but no sound came out. I woke in a cold sweat, paralyzed by horror. Yet a tiny flicker of hope remained. Maybe there was another explanation. Faith and good intentions lingered even then. The next day, we met in a park on the bench where we often used to sit, chatting about silly things. She arrived looking both beautiful and exhausted, as though she hadn't slept either. I sat in tense silence, waiting for her to speak. My heart braced for whatever was coming. Finally, she said she needed to confess something, that she felt confused and needed a break because it seemed we were moving in different directions. She claimed she didn't fully understand her own feelings, but wasn't prepared to continue as we had been. I kept silent, though a storm raged inside me. I longed to shout, "Just be honest. Did you find someone else? Did you cheat on me?" But I forced myself to stay calm and only asked, "Why?" She stammered something about needing freedom, that things had become too serious, and she wasn't sure she was ready. At that, I couldn't hold back and asked who the guy was, telling her people had seen them, and it didn't look purely friendly. She paled, her eyes darting around. She wasn't ready for a direct question. At first, she insisted he was just a friend, but I kept pressing, telling her I'd heard details from someone who witnessed them acting very much like a couple. She finally admitted there was some strange connection between them that she herself did not fully comprehend. Supposedly, he was a coworker. They spent a lot of time together traveling to events, and she found herself drawn to him. Her words stabbed me like knives. Drawn to him? Didn't fully understand. To me, it was outright betrayal. She was my girlfriend. We'd been together over a year. Suddenly, she was talking about feeling something for another man. I asked the ultimate question, "Did you sleep with him?" She looked me in the eye and hesitantly answered, "Yes, once. I don't know how it even happened." In that instant, everything I'd believed collapsed into dust. Every fragment of our memories broke apart and turned to rubble. I didn't yell, rage, or throw accusations. That might have surprised or even frightened her. Instead, I just sat there, listening to her explain how it was a spur-of-the-moment thing that happened during a work trip. She felt swept away by new opportunities, freedom, and intense emotions, and so she gave in. It was unbearably painful to hear. I pictured every date, every plan, her smile when she said I was the most important thing in her life. How could that align with giving in to someone else? I felt gutted. By the end, she said she needed time to think, but for me it was clear. I stood up, looked her in the eyes, wanting to hurl some hurtful remark, but all I managed to say was, "I never thought you were capable of this." Then I walked away. Maybe I should have demanded more details, but I couldn't stand another second in her presence. It felt like I would crack and unleash uncontrollable emotions. From that point on, everything felt drained of meaning. My apartment became cold and empty. The work that once inspired me was now just a job. I tried focusing, but memories of her always intruded. I both hated and loved her simultaneously, cursing myself for failing to see her emotional confusion sooner. Maybe if I'd been more attentive, things wouldn't have ended this way. Maybe I really had neglected her, and she went looking for comfort elsewhere. But even if that's so, why couldn't she have just told me? Why betray the relationship we'd built? For a while, I disappeared from our circle of friends. I didn't want their pitying looks or advice on how to cope with betrayal. I withdrew, only leaving home for classes and work, then coming back to sit in my dark room and listen to sad music that I would have found too depressing in another context. But I no longer cared. Life seemed hollow. I tried to erase all thoughts of her, her touch, our memories of running at dawn in the park, laughing at a comedy club's bad jokes, yet they wouldn't let go. At night, I'd wake up expecting a text or a call from her offering some explanation, but the phone stayed silent. I wasn't about to contact her first, out of pride, or maybe fear. Fear of hearing again the words that destroyed me. Weeks passed. Jason, my childhood friend, eventually called to tell me that Jennifer was still seeing that guy and that their relationship seemed to be progressing. He hesitated to share it, but figured I should know. My heart was too broken to feel shock. I only felt a dull ache, like a background noise that never let up. I thanked Jason for being honest. It's strange how life works. Someone you love with whom you made plans can so easily slip into someone else's arms and pretend nothing happened. I wondered if she ever truly loved me, or if I was merely her safe choice until something more exciting came along. It was hard to accept that reality can be so cruel, but I had no choice but to keep going somehow. Each morning became a test of will just to get out of bed and not lose my mind entirely. I woke up each day feeling like I was pinned under a suffocating blanket of pain. Workdays dragged on excruciatingly slowly. I tried to appear busy so that colleagues wouldn't ask questions and immersed myself in tasks. Yet thoughts of Jennifer would pop up in my head, breaking my focus. Nothing gave me joy. I'd occasionally text with friends, but I turned down nearly every invitation to go out. They understood my situation, but kept encouraging me not to isolate. Jason called a few times, urging me to head to the basketball court to shoot hoops like we did in high school, but I'd half-heartedly say, yeah, maybe, then hang up or text later to say I couldn't make it. A few weeks had gone by since her confession of infidelity, and the silence between us grew heavier. I never once contacted her, feeling there was no point in begging or fighting. She had made her choice. I just had to face that fact, or at least pretend to. Yet I'd still catch myself staring at old photos of us or rereading our messages, even though it only made things worse. I kept going over and over what day, what moment she decided to do this, wishing I could turn back time, pinpoint when it all started falling apart, and warn my past self to pay attention. But that was impossible. So I had to live with the crushing weight of her betrayal. One night, I asked myself, what if she wants to come back and apologize? And realized I had no idea how I'd respond. Part of me still loved her. Another part knew I could never forget her infidelity. Doubt and resentment were now woven into me. Returning to the relationship felt unthinkable, but my mind still conjured hypothetical scenarios, her at my door in tears, begging me to start over. Perhaps it was my brain's way of escaping reality, where I was alone and deserted. Or maybe I really wasn't ready to let go of someone I'd so recently called the closest person in my life. I couldn't sleep that night. At work, I was assigned to a new project involving expansion of a chain of partner stores, an opportunity to show I was ready for bigger responsibilities. But my mind was in a fog. My productivity had taken a nosedive. I'd stare at spreadsheets or read the same paragraph repeatedly, unable to recall what I was even doing. My supervisor, Thomas, noticed and asked if everything was okay. I forced a smile, blaming a lack of sleep. He was a very perceptive man and probably realized there was more to it, but he didn't push, just said I could discuss work-related issues with him anytime. I thanked him and returned to my spreadsheets, trying to concentrate. Evenings were restless. I'd go to the store for groceries, but the food felt tasteless. I often left my plate half empty. Then I'd sit by the window, drowning in loneliness. I tried to pick up an old hobby, drawing, but any sketch I made looked worthless. Frustrated, I'd toss the paper aside. Eventually, I decided this couldn't go on. I recalled my university offered a counseling center. Normally, my pride would have stopped me from seeing a psychologist, but it was time. I needed professional help or I'd drown in despair. I made an appointment with a counselor named Sarah Hudson, who I'd heard specialized in interpersonal relationships and emotional trauma. When I arrived, I felt awkward at first. A cozy room with armchairs, abstract paintings on the walls, shelves of psychology books. Sarah looked about 40, dressed casually, with a calm, friendly manner that inspired trust. She offered me tea or coffee. I declined, admitting I couldn't bring myself to eat or drink. She smiled gently and said that was fine. Then she asked, "What brought you here?" Suddenly, it was hard to speak. I realized I'd never told the full story to anyone, only bits and pieces to friends. I opened up about losing trust in my girlfriend, how she confessed to cheating, and how it left me feeling hollow. Sarah listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions. Sometimes she asked about my emotions, making me name the feelings I'd tried to hide even from myself. Several times I felt my voice quiver, especially when remembering the good times or admitting she slept with someone else. But I did feel a small measure of relief. Saying it out loud felt like I was purging some of the burden. Sarah suggested I didn't need to hurry and forgive her or patch things up right away, nor should I blame myself for not seeing it sooner. People change, circumstances change, and relationships can crumble if nobody dares say, "I'm not sure I want this anymore." Of course, infidelity is more than a mere mismatch. But she explained it often arises from silence and reluctance to address issues. She said my grief was a normal response to betrayal, but I shouldn't remain stuck in it. I left that session feeling just as sad, but also slightly more hopeful that I could gradually recover. The next day, Emily called me to say that Jennifer wanted to know how I was, but didn't dare contact me directly. I swallowed my pain and told Emily I was fine and had nothing to discuss with Jennifer. Emily sighed, said she understood. She hinted that Jennifer likely regretted what happened, fully aware of the damage caused. That didn't comfort me. If Jennifer wanted to talk, she should do it herself, not through a friend. Then again, maybe she was consumed by guilt, or maybe she was happy with the other guy and just wanted me not to suffer. I wasn't sure. Still, it made me realize maybe she hadn't completely buried the past. A few days later, I ran into David, the mutual friend who hosted the party where Jennifer and I first met, in the university hallway. He said he'd heard about our situation and was sorry. We chatted, and I learned that Jennifer rarely hung out with their old group anymore, for spending more time with new coworkers. He mentioned rumors that things with that guy weren't so perfect either. I didn't know if it was just gossip, but it made my chest tighten. Part of me felt malicious satisfaction. Serves you right. Found someone else? Are you happy now? But another part felt nothing but pain that I had to hear these rumors at all, as if we were living in a silly soap opera. After several more sessions with Sarah, I felt a bit more stable. She taught me not to get bogged down in self-blame and encouraged me to stay connected to friends rather than isolate. I took up morning runs again, dusting off the old running shoes Jennifer and I used to use, a decision that initially felt masochistic, but Sarah insisted that reclaiming old routines with new purpose can help release the past. I compiled a playlist of upbeat running tracks and slowly got into it. Of course, every time I jogged that trail, I remembered how she once teased me about running faster just so I wouldn't lose sight of her red-tinted hair. But the pain was less intense now, more of a quiet shadow. My friends Jason and Luke decided to drag me to a local baseball match one day. An amateur league game, no big stars, but still lively. I first refused, but they insisted it helped me break the routine. I finally agreed. We sat in the stands, bought popcorn and soda, chatted about nonsense, and I found it slightly easier to breathe. People around us laughed, cheered, and shouted for their teams. For a couple of hours, I remembered that life doesn't revolve solely around Jennifer's betrayal. I bumped into an old acquaintance named Nick there. We'd studied in parallel classes back in the day. He mentioned he'd seen me near a shopping center recently, walking quickly and looking lost in thought. Then he told me he'd taken up pottery as a relaxation method, inviting me to join him at a local studio where, for a small fee, you can learn basic techniques and make ceramic pieces. I'd never imagined myself at a potter's wheel, but at that moment I thought, why not? Any new experience might help me heal. I told him maybe I'd check it out when I was ready. Time passed, and then one day, Jennifer called. I saw her name on the screen and felt my heart skip. I hesitated to answer, but curiosity and perhaps some lingering feelings won out. Her voice was subdued. She asked if I could spare a few minutes to talk. I stiffly said I was listening. She began apologizing, haltingly, saying she knew how deeply she'd hurt me, that she wasn't asking for instant forgiveness, only to explain. My insides churned, but I stayed silent. She said that ever since we separated, she'd been anxious, realizing she should never have acted that way. She claimed she got swept up by her feelings for someone who seemed so fresh and exciting, then quickly discovered it was just an illusion. She admitted she couldn't stop thinking about me, about us. Her confession threw me off balance. On the one hand, I'd imagined such conversations 1,000 times, but now she was saying all this for real, her voice trembling with tears. On the other hand, I knew there was no going back, or at least not the way things were. I coldly replied that her regret didn't erase the betrayal. She pleaded for me to hear her out in person. Unsure if I was ready to see her again, I warned her I couldn't promise anything. She sounded desperate, asking for one chance to speak face to face, after which I could decide if I wanted her gone for good or might consider giving us another chance. It was clearly my choice. No one could do it for me. I was torn. Part of me dreaded revisiting the turmoil of jealousy, anger, and despair. Another part of me was curious and still emotionally tied. I recalled Sarah's advice about needing closure, that sometimes a frank conversation can help you move on, even if it confirms the final break. Ultimately, I agreed to meet but insisted I wasn't guaranteeing any outcome. She quietly thanked me, said she'd text the time and place, and we hung up. Afterward, I felt shaky with conflicting emotions. For the next 2 days before our meeting, I could hardly function at work. We arranged to see each other in a small cafe where we'd often had coffee. I knew it was a place saturated with memories which might open old wounds, but presumably that was her intention, something familiar, a nod to a less tragic time. On the day we met, I arrived early and took a seat by the window, watching car lights flash by outside, random pedestrians passing. My hands trembled slightly. She came in, glancing around until our eyes met. My stomach lurched. Months had passed, and she looked thinner, her eyes filled with sadness despite a tentative smile. I gestured for her to sit. We spent a few minutes in silence, not knowing how to begin. The tension was palpable, almost tangible. I wanted to blurt out, "What do you want from me? Do you really think we can just start over?" But I stayed quiet, letting her speak first. She apologized, trying to hold back tears, saying she realized she'd wronged me in the worst way and wished she could turn back time. She explained she'd felt caged by the seriousness of our relationship, craving new experiences. This coworker showed her a glimpse of freedom, and she let herself be tempted. But that freedom turned out to be an empty illusion. She distanced herself from her old circle of friends, and that guy soon lost interest too. She felt she'd lost the most important thing: our relationship, love, friendship, trust. I listened without much expression, though inside I felt waves of anger and sorrow. I wanted to shout, "So what now? Can you fix a shattered bond?" But I kept control. She looked at me, pleading, saying she wanted to change, was willing to address her fears. I could tell it pained her to admit all of this. She tore at the napkin in her hands. Still, it was hard for me to sympathize. The memory of her betrayal was too vivid. Eventually, she asked quietly, "Is there any chance you could ever let me be in your life again?" I stared at the design on my coffee cup, unable to answer. Inside, love, resentment, anger, and regret all wrestled. After a long, painful silence, I finally said, "I don't know. I'm not sure I can. Everything I felt was so strong, and your betrayal was just as strong. I need time, and maybe I'll never be able to go back." She looked down, tears in her eyes, then whispered, "I understand. Thank you for at least listening. I hope you'll be happy, even if it's not with me." We paid, left, and stepped outside under the street lamps. A light drizzle shimmered in the glow. I looked at her, feeling like she was a stranger, though not long ago she was the closest person to me. She tried to hug me goodbye, but I backed away, knowing I wasn't ready. She nodded sadly and said, "Take care," then walked off, heading for a parked car. I stood there a long while, watching her go, my chest tight with pain and emptiness. But I knew we couldn't restore what we had with one talk. After that, I kept seeing Sarah for counseling, explaining how our meeting left me even more uncertain about the future. Part of me was proud I'd finally climbed out of the emotional pit I'd fallen into after her betrayal. Another part of me was tempted by the possibility of reconciliation, thinking maybe people really can change. But would that just mean opening myself up to more heartbreak? I admitted to Sarah I didn't believe I could ever trust Jennifer the same way again. Sarah suggested I not make any major decisions while still in turmoil. Perhaps time would help me see if I could release my anger or not. The key, she said, was that any decision be mine alone, not made under pressure or guilt. As the weeks went on, every day was a battle with my own demons. Yet I gradually began to handle it better. I stayed in touch with friends, sometimes joining them at bars for a change of scenery. We even went to a concert, and for the first time in ages, I let the music fill me with energy. I even found myself dancing. I realized at some point I'd gone minutes without thinking of her, and I felt a spark of hope that life could be normal again. at least for brief spells. Meanwhile, work was improving. I tried to demonstrate I was still valuable to the team, and my partner store expansion project started bearing fruit. Thomas was pleased, commenting on how well I'd performed. After a meeting one day, he pulled me aside, mentioning he'd be happy to recommend me for a higher position. It felt like a bolt from the blue. I thanked him, barely hiding my shaky voice. Evidently, I'd managed to keep it together enough that my work quality hadn't fallen off as much as I'd feared. On my way home, I realized this is what life does. It doesn't stop, even when you're grieving or feel lost. New opportunities can arise, new people can enter your life. You just have to find the strength not to refuse them. Admittedly, the specter of the past was still there. I couldn't just forget everything about Jennifer overnight. But I was having more and more days when I recalled her with a sense of sadness rather than searing pain, as if remembering something that happened in another life. That fall, I made another bold move. I decided to move to a different apartment. My old place, though convenient, held too many memories. The corner where she'd hung her photos, the shelf where she kept her design books, her favorite pillow. Summoning my courage, I listed my old apartment for rent and found a new place fairly quickly. Bigger, close to work, with a nice layout. The day I packed up my belongings was filled with mixed emotions. I found old photos of us, gifts she'd given me. But I told myself I couldn't live in a museum of broken memories anymore. Some items I threw away, others I put in a box and stored out of sight. Crossing the threshold of my new place, the empty walls made it feel strange, not yet reflecting my energy. But I sensed this was a space for me alone, a place to rebuild. I slowly walked through the rooms, imagining where I'd put furniture, and felt a wave of relief. A flicker of hope lit up inside me, as if life had handed me a blank slate to fill with my own new story. The ghosts of the past hadn't vanished, but I had learned to carry on with them, rather than be paralyzed by them. Jennifer and I exchanged a few texts after that conversation in the cafe. She asked how I was, said she was glad to see I was managing better. I responded politely but briefly, without suggesting any closeness. We once ran into each other by chance downtown. She looked apologetic and asked if all was okay. I told her I was fine, busy with work and friends, and that was that. I could see she felt awkward, perhaps wanting to stay in contact, but I didn't feel any desire for more. Maybe one day I'd be ready for a casual friendship or an occasional meeting without pain. But for now, our paths had diverged. One evening, after unpacking most of my boxes, I sat by my new window with a glass of whiskey, watching headlights sweep the walls. I let myself recall how we once believed anything was possible if we were together. I sank into those memories, not feeling that raw agony, but rather reflecting on a completed chapter. I realized that, despite everything, I was grateful for the happy moments we shared, because they shaped a part of me. But I no longer wanted to live in the past. That night, I decided to invite my friends over for a small housewarming party to celebrate this new chapter. Maybe it wasn't a complete victory over my pain, but it was definitely a step into the light. I called Jason, asked him to bring Luke and a couple of our close friends. He agreed excitedly, telling me he'd been waiting for me to make a move. I hung up, closed my eyes, and felt genuine relief, sensing that I could leave this dark period behind me. Certainly, I still had many internal battles ahead, but at least I knew that, if I had managed to survive this heartbreak and learn to process the pain, I could face whatever came next. I held on to the belief that I might emerge stronger, even if I carried scars. The next day my friends arrived, and we shoved a couple of tables together, brought food and drinks, turned on music, the room filled with laughter, conversation, and stories from our shared past. I noticed I could finally joke around and carry on a conversation without constantly thinking of her betrayal. At one point, Jason said, "Dude, this is more like the Michael I know." I smiled. Sure, I wasn't the old Michael, but at least I was the person who managed to get back up after being knocked down, even if I'd never be quite the same. That night, I understood I'd embarked on a new chapter, even if it held many uncertainties. Yet now I could look toward the future with less fear and fewer endless questions of, how could she do this? We partied into the late hours, with some friends crashing on my pull-out couch, others heading home after hugging me goodbye and saying how glad they were to see me lively again. I stayed up a while longer, but this time it was a peaceful tiredness, not the tortured insomnia of before. I sensed a sort of liberation, as if the nightmares were tapering off. Not that the pain was gone, it still lingered, and I knew it might resurface from time to time. But I understood it wouldn't be eternal if I kept moving forward, working on myself, and remaining open to the world. And so a gentle sense of forgiveness, both toward her and myself, began to grow. I realized that from our time together, I could take not only pain, but also lessons I might not have learned otherwise. And I still believed, despite the betrayal and the breakup, I was capable of loving again and being loved. I'd simply be more cautious and attentive to myself and to whoever might walk beside me in the future.